Su-yeon didn't even look at her when she said it. She just pointed at the floor, the cold, bare living room floor, and told Nia that was where she would be sleeping tonight. Not the guest room, not the couch, the floor. Because a relative was visiting, and relatives came first. That was the rule. That had always been the rule. Nia stood there, holding her own pillow in her own home, and said nothing. Because what could she say? Who would she tell? Her husband was 3 states away, running an empire that everyone feared everyone except the woman standing in his foyer, pointing at the floor like Nia was furniture being moved out of the way. If you've ever been made to feel invisible in a place that was supposed to be yours, keep watching. Because the night Min-Jae came home early, everything changed. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're not alone. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. And drop your city or country in the comments. Right now I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Hit that like button too. Now let's get into it. The first time it happened, Nia told herself it was temporary. That was the word she used inside her own head, temporary, the way people use that word, when they don't yet understand that temporary has a way of becoming permanent the moment you stop fighting it. It was a Tuesday in October, 13 months after the wedding, and Min-Jae had been called to Seoul on business that he explained only partially, the way he explained most things in pieces, like a puzzle he expected her to appreciate without ever seeing the full picture. He'd kissed her forehead at 5 in the morning, told her he'd be back in 4 days, and by 9 that same morning, before the smell of his cologne had even left the sheets, a black SUV had pulled through the estate gates carrying his mother. 2 aunts and a cousin Nia had met exactly once at the wedding reception and hadn't been able to place since. Su-yeon didn't knock. She had her own key. Min-Jae had given it to her years before Nia existed in his life, and the fact that Nia was now the woman living behind that door didn't seem to register as a reason to change the arrangement. We'll be staying through the weekend, Su-yeon announced, walking past Nia in the entryway, the way someone walks past a coat rack, acknowledging it exists, choosing not to interact with it. Nia had smiled then. She actually smiled, because she was still new enough to the Kang family to believe that the right amount of warmth and patience could soften things. She made tea. She offered the guest rooms. She asked about the flight. Su-yeon settled into an armchair in the main living room and began giving instructions to the 2 aunts in Korean, occasionally glancing at Nia with the particular expression of a woman who is pretending to be polite, make it clear that politeness is a performance she can drop the moment she chooses. The guest rooms, it turned out, were not for the aunts. Su-jin will take the master bedroom. Su-yeon said that first evening, referring to the cousin the young woman Nia barely knew. She's back problems. She needs a proper bed. Nia blinked. That's our room. Min-Jae won't be here. I'll be here. Su-yeon looked at her with an expression that was almost kind, the way a teacher looks at a student who has given a fundamentally incorrect answer and doesn't yet realize it. You can use the sitting room downstairs. The sofa there is very comfortable. And that was it. That was the entirety of the conversation. No argument, no compromise. Just the assumption delivered as a fact that Nia's comfort was a variable, and Su-jin's comfort was a fixed point around which everything else would be arranged. Nia wanted to push back. She ran through the words in her head, the logical, firm, reasonable words she could say, to explain that this was her home, her bedroom, her marriage. But something stopped her. Not fear exactly, not that night. More like the recognition that she was standing in a room full of people who all spoke a language she didn't speak, who had known Min-Jae for 35 years longer than she had, and who shared a history she would never fully access, no matter how many years she lived in this house. She slept on the sofa that night with a throw blanket that wasn't quite long enough, staring at the ceiling of a house worth more than most people made in a lifetime, feeling like a guest in her own life. She told herself it was temporary. She was wrong. By the second visit, 6 weeks later, while Min-Jae was in Chicago, for what he said would be 3 days and stretched to 7, the sofa was no longer an option either. A great aunt from Busan had taken it, having arrived the previous afternoon without any notice, And Soo-yeon presented this development with the casual indifference of someone announcing a minor schedule change. "You'll be fine downstairs," she said, and this time she didn't specify where downstairs, because she expected Nia to understand that the specifics were hers to figure out. Nia found a spare blanket in the hallway closet. She folded it twice and laid it on the living room floor beside the coffee table and lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of her own house, the footsteps of above her, the running water, the distant murmur of conversation in Korean, and she made a decision. She would tell Min-Jae when he got home. She would explain what was happening. She would be calm and direct, and he would understand, because Min-Jae was many things. But he wasn't a man who tolerated disrespect. She'd seen that in every other area of his life. Seen how quickly people corrected themselves when they understood they'd crossed a line with him. Surely the same rules applied here. Surely when she explained it, he would fix it. Min-Jae came home on a Wednesday evening. He was tired in the particular way he got after extended trips, quiet, distracted, working through something in his head that he hadn't fully resolved. He kissed her at the door and asked if she'd eaten, and poured himself a drink before he'd even taken off his jacket. Nia sat across from him at the kitchen counter. She had planned what she would say. She'd actually written some of it out in her phone's notes app, not because she needed the script, but because writing it had helped her believe she would actually say it. She opened her mouth, and then Min-Jae said, "My mother mentioned that her cousin had some kind of back episode. She's getting older. I'm glad they could come stay." That was all, said with complete innocence, not as a warning, not as a test, just information offered warmly by a man who had been told a version of events that sounded like a family looking after its own. Nia closed her mouth. She folded the notes inside herself and left them there. Because how do you correct that story? How do you look at a man who is clearly relieved that his aging family members are comfortable and say, "Actually, I was sleeping on the floor while your cousin took our bed"? How do you say it without sounding like the woman who resents his family for existing? How do you say it without becoming the villain of the story that Soo-yeon had already started writing? She didn't say it. And that silence, that single specific silence, became the crack in the foundation that everything else poured through. By the fifth visit, Nia no longer pretended she had a choice. She knew the shape of it now. She knew how it worked. Min-Jae would leave. The gates would open within 24 hours. The family would arrive, sometimes 2 people, sometimes 8, and Soo-yeon would begin redistributing the house like a general reassigning territory, and Nia would be reduced, room by room, until she occupied the smallest possible space and was expected to be grateful even for that. The guest room, the perfectly good, fully furnished guest room with its own attached bathroom on the second floor, was never offered to her. She asked about it once, early on, in the 3rd month of this pattern. Why couldn't she use that room while her own was occupied? Soo-yeon had tilted her head with that manufactured patience she wore like a costume. That room is for family, the implication being that Nia was not. The implication being that the legal document she had signed, the ring on her finger, the name she now carried, none of it had actually granted her entry into the category of people who mattered in this house when Min-Jae wasn't watching. What she also understood, by the 5th visit, was the other part of the architecture, the threat that lived underneath everything, never spoken plainly but always present, humming at the base of every interaction, like a current you couldn't see but could absolutely feel. It came in small moments. The way Soo-yeon would sometimes say, with elaborate casualness, "Min-Jae is so close to his family. He would be devastated if something damaged that." The way an aunt once remarked, after Nia had pushed back about someone going through her closet without permission, "We don't want to cause trouble in this family. Some things are better left alone." The way Soo-yeon, at the end of that same visit, looked at Nia directly and said, very quietly, "If you complain to my son, you will be the woman who tore his family apart. Is that who you want to be?" She said it gently. That was the worst part. She said it the way some delivers a regrettable piece of news, with a tone that suggested she was doing Nia a favor by being honest. And Nia, who was intelligent and clear-eyed about almost everything in her life, who had grown up in a household where her mother had taught her that a woman's silence was not the same thing as her weakness. Nia believed her. Not because she was naive, because she was watching. She watched how Min-Jae talked about his mother with a reverence that wasn't blind exactly, but was old. The kind of love that gets formed before you're old enough to question it, and then calcifies into something you protect without examining. She watched how he talked about family obligation, how seriously he took it, how he had built his entire empire on a structure of loyalty that began with blood. She watched how he never questioned his mother's accounts of things, never looked for alternative explanations. Never occurred to him that the woman who raised him might be capable of orchestrating harm against his wife in a house Nia was supposed to be safe in. She was not safe. She understood that by month 8. She understood it in her body before she fully understood it in her mind, that specific tiredness that isn't about sleep, the way you start to shrink your posture in spaces you should inhabit fully, the way you stop leaving things in rooms, because you've learned they'll be moved or used or dismissed as unimportant. She stopped keeping her books in the living room. She stopped leaving her running shoes by the front door. She started eating before the family arrived, because meal times had become exercises in invisibility. She would cook, or the housekeeper would cook, and the food would be laid out, and the family would gather, and Nia would sit somewhere at the edge of the table, passed over in conversation, occasionally handed a task more water. Please. The remote is across the room, as though her presence at the table was conditional on her usefulness to it. She had one friend she talked to during this period, a woman named Dija, who had been her closest friend since college, who lived in Brooklyn and called every Sunday and never failed to notice when something was being left out of the conversation. "You sound different," Dija said, on Sunday, 3 months into the pattern. "I'm fine," Nia said. "Nia, I'm fine, Dija." There was a long pause on the line. "Are you happy there?" Nia looked out the window at the estate grounds. The immaculate lawns, the circular driveway, the iron gate at the far end of the property that stayed closed, unless Min-Jae opened it, or someone with a code pressed the button on the intercom panel. It was beautiful. She had thought it was beautiful the first time she saw it, and she still thought it was beautiful, and beauty had turned out to be a strange companion for the feeling she carried inside this place. "I'm working on it," she said. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't what Dija had asked. Dija let it go. She always let it go eventually, because Nia had never been someone you could pull information from, you had to wait for her to offer it, and she offered it on her own timeline, if ever. It was one of the things Min-Jae had said he admired about her when they first met, her self-containment, the way she processed things internally without scattering pieces of herself everywhere. He'd called it strength. He didn't know it had become a cage. By the time a full year had passed since the first incident, Nia had her floor routine down to something that might have looked, from a distance, like efficiency. She knew which closet held the extra blankets. She knew which corner of the living room had the most give in the floorboards, and which one was harder. She knew from experience that sleeping on her left side was better on nights when her hip was already sore from the day. She knew to set her phone alarm for 6:15, so she was up and presentable before the rest of the household stirred. Because being found asleep on the floor was one thing, but being found there in the morning light, in front of everyone, felt like a different category of humiliation. She had become, without ever choosing it, a woman who had optimized her own degradation. The thought came to her one morning in February, sitting up from the floor, with her blanket folded across her arms and her body aching the way bodies ache when they are not given what they need. And she sat there for a moment in the gray pre-dawn quiet of a house full of people who had taken everything of hers that wasn't nailed down. And she thought, "I am good at this now. That is the worst thing I could possibly say about myself." She cried that morning, in the downstairs bathroom, with the water running, so no one would hear. Not the kind of dramatic crying that signals a turning point, just the kind that happens when a person finally stops managing their own grief and lets a little of it out before pushing it back down and going to make breakfast for people who wouldn't thank her for it. She was 31 years old. She had a master's degree. She had walked away from a career she loved to come live in this house, because Min-Jae had asked her to, because he'd said, "I want you with me. I want to build something real. I need someone next to me who isn't part of all this meaning, the business, the men, the machinery of power he'd spent 15 years constructing. He'd meant it as the truest thing he'd ever offered anyone. She'd understood it that way. She still believed he'd meant it. That was the complicated part. The part that made Deja's questions difficult to answer and made the floor, in a sick way, bearable. She didn't think Min-Jae was a bad man. She didn't think he'd built a situation designed to diminish her. She thought he had a catastrophic blind spot, a place where the two most important parts of his life overlapped, and he had simply never looked at what was happening inside that overlap. He trusted his mother. He trusted Nia. And so in his mind, the two of them existed in a household that was functioning, because both of the people he trusted would have told him if it wasn't. What he didn't account for was that one of those people had something to lose by telling him, and the other had something to lose by telling him too. That was the trap. That was the elegant, devastating trap that Soo-yeon had built and Nia had walked straight into, not because she was foolish, but because she had tried to be good. Because she had wanted to be the woman who didn't cause problems, who was patient, who let things settle, who didn't make her husband choose between his family and his wife in the first year of their marriage. The goodness of her had been used against her. And by the time she understood that fully, she had been doing this long enough that telling the truth felt like arriving at a crime scene, years late, everything already disturbed, already moved, already narrated by someone else. What did she have? Her word against 13 months of silence that could be, and would be, reframed as acceptance. She thought about that on the floor. Late at night with the chandelier above her dark and the sounds of the house settling around her. She thought about what her silence had cost her, and she thought about what breaking it might cost her. And she lay there in the specific loneliness of a person who is not alone, who is surrounded by people, technically sleeping above and around her, but who has never felt the presence of another human being as something directed at her, warmly in this house. Upstairs, the master bedroom sat occupied by someone else. The guest room sat empty. Min-Jae was in Boston. Outside, a storm was beginning to build. She didn't know it yet, but it was the last storm she would lie through on that floor. She didn't know that somewhere on I-985, a black sedan was cutting through the rain, 2 days ahead of schedule, its driver's hands loose on the wheel, and its passenger staring out at the dark with the look of a man whose instincts, honed by 15 years of surviving a world that didn't forgive inattention, were telling him something was wrong at home. He didn't know what. He knew enough. The gates of the estate were going to open that night, and for the first time in over a year, the person coming through them was going to be the one person in this house whose arrival changed everything. Nia pulled her blanket tighter. The storm outside pressed against the windows. She closed her eyes. She had no idea that this was the last night. The headlights came first. They swept across the ceiling in a wide arc, 2 pale beams cutting through the rain-streaked windows and traveling slowly across the plaster above Nia's head like something searching for her, specifically. She registered them, the way you register a sound in a dream, not quite awake, not quite gone. Her body still waited with the particular exhaustion of a woman who had learned to sleep lightly on hard surfaces, because deep sleep on a floor felt like a surrender she couldn't afford. She didn't move. Her eyes opened halfway, found the ceiling, found the rain-blurred light traveling across it, and her brain filed it under probably nothing a car turning around in the driveway. A delivery truck that had gotten turned around on the private road. Something ordinary and irrelevant. Min-Jae wasn't due back until Friday. It was Wednesday. 1:17 in the morning, according to the clock on her phone, which was on the floor beside her, because there was nowhere else to put it. She closed her eyes again. The engine didn't leave. She heard it cut off instead, that specific silence that follows an engine, more present than sounds itself. And then she heard a car door, and then footsteps on wet stone, and then the particular sound of the front door's security panel being disarmed from the outside. 3 beeps. The door opened. Nia's eyes came all the way open. She lay perfectly still in the dark for 1 full second, listening to the sound of footsteps in the entryway one set, measured and unhurried, The kind of footsteps that belong to someone who is used to moving through this house, who doesn't need to orient themselves or feel for walls. The kind of footsteps she hadn't heard in 9 days. She sat up. The blanket fell from her shoulders to the floor, and she sat there on the hard wood in the dark living room, with her hair flattened on one side and her left hip already beginning to register the night's complaints. And she heard Min-Jae stop walking in the entryway. She heard him set something down his bag, probably, that heavy black duffel he always carried for shorter trips. She heard him pause. She didn't call out to him. She didn't know why, exactly. Maybe because she wasn't ready. Maybe because some part of her, the part that had spent 13 months managing information carefully, needed one more second before the version of her life she'd been hiding became visible to him. The overhead light in the entryway clicked on. Its glow reached the living room in a diluted way, not full brightness, but enough to illuminate the blanket on the floor, the pillow she'd folded under her head, the small arrangement of her phone and her water glass, and her book that anyone with eyes would recognize as this nightstand setup of a person who slept in this spot with some regularity. She heard him breathe. Then she heard him walk toward the living room doorway, and then the shadow of him was there, tall in the frame, and he was looking at her. She looked back at him. Min-Jae had a face that gave very little away. As a matter of discipline, she'd learned that early. The men around him read him by the small things, how slowly he blinked, where his hands were, whether the muscle in his jaw was moving. She had become fluent in those signals over 2 years of marriage. She read him now in the fraction of a second, before either of them spoke, and what she read was not anger and not confusion exactly. It was something more primitive than either of those things. It was the expression of a man whose understanding of a situation has just been revised so fundamentally that his mind is still catching up to what his eyes are seeing. He looked at her on the floor. He looked at the blanket. He looked at the careful little arrangements beside her. And he knelt down, not dramatically, not with urgency. He just folded himself down until he was as at her level, his coat still wet from the rain outside, and he looked at her from 2 feet away with an expression she had never seen on him before and said, quietly, "Why are you sleeping here?" The question was simple. She had imagined this moment, or some version of it, dozens of times, lying on this same floor in the dark. She had scripted answers. She had planned the words, decided on the right tone, determined how much to say and how much to hold back. She had a whole architecture of truth waiting to be delivered calmly and clearly. What she said was, there wasn't room upstairs. He didn't move. There wasn't room, Min-Jae. There are 12 rooms in this house. His voice was still quiet. That was the thing about him, that people who only knew him by reputation always misunderstood. They expected volume. They expected the performance of power. What they got, when something had actually registered, was the opposite. He got very, very still. There is a guest room 20 feet from our bedroom that has been empty since we redid it 8 months ago. She said nothing. He looked at the blanket again. It was the way he looked at it slowly, cataloging it, that made something in her chest contract. He was a man who processed crime scenes for a living, in a manner of speaking. He knew the difference between a thing that had just happened and a thing that had happened many times before. "This isn't the first time," he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer quickly enough. "Nia." His voice dropped further, which meant it was more serious, not less. "How long has this been happening?" She looked at him. She wanted to give him the careful version, the version that softened the edges, that took responsibility for her own silence, that framed it in a way that didn't light everything in this house on fire at 1 in the morning, while his mother slept 20 feet above their heads. She was so tired of the careful version. "Every time you leave," she said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that has weight and texture, the kind you feel against your skin. Min-Jae sat back on his heels. He was looking at her, but she had the impression he was also seeing something that wasn't in this room, some map of the past year being redrawn in real time, landmarks moving, territories he thought he understood rearranging themselves into a geography he didn't recognize. He reached out and touched the blanket, just pressed his hand flat against it for a moment, like he was confirming it was real. Then he stood up. He didn't say anything else to her right then. He walked toward the staircase and she heard him take the stairs with the same measured pace. He did everything. And then she heard him on the second floor, footsteps moving down the hall, stopping, a door opening, a pause, a door closing, footsteps continuing. She understood what he was doing. He was checking rooms. He was doing the accounting in his head that she had laid out for him in 6 words. She heard him stop outside the master bedroom. She heard him open that door. There was a silence, and then the door closed again, and his footsteps came back toward the top of the stairs. He appeared at the bottom a moment later. He was holding himself differently, not tense exactly, but consolidated the way a person consolidates themselves when they're managing something internal that they haven't decided yet what to do with. "Get up," he said. "Come upstairs. Min-Jae." He said her name with a gentleness that was somehow more difficult to bear than anger would have been. "Please get up from the floor." She gathered the blanket. She stood up, and her body made its complaints, known her hip, her lower back, the specific stiffness of a person who had been sleeping on hardwood for most of the night. She saw his eyes track that movement. She saw him clock the way she rolled her shoulder, the way she put her hand briefly on her lower back. His jaw was doing the thing. He said nothing. He led her upstairs. He walked past the master bedroom without stopping and opened the door to his private study, a room that had a wide leather sofa long enough to sleep on comfortably, which he sometimes did when he worked late, and that room had a lock on the inside. "Sleep in here tonight," he said. "The door locks." She stood in the doorway. "You're not sleeping?" "No," he said. She understood from the tone of that single syllable that whatever was going to happen next was something she should not be present for in its early stages. She had seen him manage difficult things before. She had never been the reason for the difficulty. She went inside. She heard the door of the study click behind her. She sat down on the leather sofa with the folded blanket in her hands and sat there in the dark for a long time, listening to the house. She heard him at some point knock on the master bedroom door. She heard a voice, Soo-yeon's voice, startled and disoriented, the voice of a woman being woken at 1 a.m, and then Min-Jae's voice, low and specific. She couldn't make out words. She didn't need to. She could hear the shape of the conversation, the initial confusion, the shift, the moment when Soo-yeon's voice changed register from sleepy to something sharper and more careful. Then quiet. Then footsteps, multiple sets now, and the sound of a door, and the phrases in Korean that moved through the hallway and down the stairs. She closed her eyes in the dark of the study and pressed her back against the leather sofa and waited. Downstairs, the lights came on. She could see the change in the thin line of brightness under the study door, the shift from darkness to the full warm light of the main chandelier, which Min-Jae only turned on when he wanted a space to feel exposed, when he wanted everyone in it to understand that this was not a private conversation. She heard voices below her. More of them now, the relatives being woken, gathering in the living room with the particular disorganized energy of people who don't understand why they've been assembled and are already building defensive explanations. Then she heard Soo-yeon's voice rise above the others. That was when Nia stood up. She didn't make a decision exactly. Her body just made it for her. Stood up, crossed the room, put her hand on the door handle. Because whatever was happening below her, it was happening about her. And she had spent 13 months being discussed and arranged and decided about in rooms she wasn't in. And she was done with that. She was going downstairs. The scene that met her at the bottom of the staircase would have looked, to an outside observer, like a family gathering in the middle of the night, 9 people arranged throughout the living room in a connecting hallway, some standing, some on sofas, one aunt still pulling a cardigan closed over her nightclothes. Min-Jae was standing at the center of the room with his coat still on, his arms at his sides, and every person in the room was oriented toward him the way iron filings orient toward a magnetic field. Except Soo-yeon. Soo-yeon was standing opposite him, and she was the only person in the room who looked fully awake, who had clearly woken quickly, reoriented quickly, and had already begun constructing the version of events she intended to present. She saw Nia on the stairs. Something moved across her face, not guilt. Soo-yeon didn't do guilt, or at least she'd had decades of practice keeping it off her face. What crossed her face was calculation. The quick assessment of a woman who has been caught mid-narrative and is deciding how to revise it. Nea, she said, and her voice carried that particular warmth, the warmth she used when Min-Jae was present, that performed maternal softness that Nea had learned to hear as a warning signal. Come and sit down. We're having a misunderstanding. Nea came down the last 3 steps and stood in the living room. She looked at the floor where she'd been sleeping. The blanket was still there, exactly as she'd left it, kicked slightly to the side, the imprint of her body still in it. Nobody had moved it. The pillow was still where it had been, the phone charging cable still snaking across the hardwood. Evidence. Accidental and irrefutable. Several of the relatives were looking at the blanket. Several of them were looking at Nea. An aunt near the doorway, a woman who had ordered Nea to bring more water at dinner 3 visits ago, without making eye contact while doing, it was now looking at the floor with an expression that suggested she was doing. Rapid calculations about her own level of involvement. Min-Jae watched Naya cross the room. He watched her stop a few feet from him and stand there, and the question of what she would do, now what she would say, whether she would protect everyone again, the way she always had, was sitting in the air between them, visible as weather. Explain to me, Min-Jae said, and he was speaking to the room, but his eyes hadn't left his mother, why my wife was sleeping on that floor. She wasn't comfortable upstairs, Soo-yeon said immediately. She said so herself. The lie was so clean, so quick, delivered with such steady eye contact, that Nea actually felt a chill. Because that was the move. That was the whole game, laid out in 9 words. She said so herself. Nea, who never complained, who had built her silences into a record that could now be read in reverse, reinterpreted as agreement, as preference, as she chose this, no one forced her. Naya heard the blood in her ears. I never said that, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She was surprised by it. Soo-yeon turned to her with an expression of gentle confusion. Nea, the first night, you said you didn't mind. I said I didn't want to cause trouble. The words came out before she could sort them. That is not the same thing as saying I didn't mind. A beat of silence. Min-Jae was looking at her now. Really looking. I never said I didn't mind, continued, and something in her was very carefully not looking at the expression on his face, because if she looked at it she might stop, and she could not stop now. The words were already out. They were already in the air, and there was no architecture capable of putting them back. I said I didn't want to cause trouble, because every time I said anything, every time I tried to tell someone this wasn't okay, the answer was the same. Tell Min-Jae and I'd be the woman who broke this family. She looked at Soo-yeon when she said the last part. Soo-yeon's face had gone very still. Who said that to you? Min-Jae's voice was quiet. So quiet. Nobody in the room was breathing. Who? He said again. And this time there was something underneath the word that had no temperature at all, not hot, not cold, just a complete absence of affect that was somehow more frightening than either. It was made clear, Nea said carefully, in different ways, over a long time. She looked at him. Since the 2nd month we were married. The room absorbed that. One of the younger relatives, a man near the hallway who had been staying here 3 days and had twice left dishes in the sink that were obviously meant for Naya to wash, shifted his weight, and the floorboard creaked, and the sound was extraordinarily loud in the silence. Soo-yeon moved first. She moved toward Min-Jae, not toward Naya, toward her son, and her voice shifted into something private, something that implied this was a family conversation, and Naya was interrupting it. Min-Jae, you're tired. You just drove back in the rain. This is not the time. Don't, he said. 1 word. Soo-yeon stopped. Don't tell me what time it is, he said. Don't manage this. For the first time since Nea had come downstairs, she watched something crack, very slightly, in his mother's composure. It was small, a tightening around the eyes, a slight compression of the mouth, but it was there, and Nea could see that Soo-yeon had also clocked it and was already working on recovery. I only wanted to... There's an entire guest room upstairs, Min-Jae said. Empty. I just walked past it. It has a bed in it. It has sheets on the bed, and my wife has been sleeping down here. She never asked. She shouldn't have to ask. His voice broke on the last word, not with grief, but with something that sounded like anger finding its shape, like water finding a crack. She lives here. She doesn't ask to use the rooms in her own house. This is a family home. She is my family. The room went silent in a different way this time. Before it had been the silence of people listening. Now it was the silence of people who have heard a line drawn and are waiting to understand which side of it they are standing on. Soo-yeon looked at her son for a long moment, and then she did something that Nia recognized from 13 months of experience. She pivoted. Not a retreat, a repositioning. She turned to look at the room, at the relatives, and she let her expression shift into something sorrowful and wronged. The expression of a mother who had tried her best and was now being misunderstood by a son who wasn't hearing the full picture. I kept this house for you for 20 years before she came here, Soo-yeon said. Her voice had changed, not soft exactly, but layered with something designed to resonate with him, with the part of him that was her son before he was Nia's husband. I raised you in this family. I kept these people together. And now I am being spoken to like I have done something criminal because she was on the floor. Min-Jae's voice didn't rise. Ma, she was on the floor. She never complained. She was threatened. He said it flat and clean. You heard what she said. She was told to stay quiet, and she did, because she was trying to protect this family. He paused. From itself. Soo-yeon's mouth opened. Nothing came out. And Nia, standing a few feet away watching it happen, felt the specific vertigo of hearing someone else say out loud, the thing you have carried alone in your body for over a year. She felt her eyes burn, and she absolutely refused to cry. Not here, not in front of these people, because she had given them 13 months of her silence, and she would not give them her tears on top of it. She kept her face even. She breathed. One of the aunts said something in Korean low, directed at Soo-yeon, and Min-Jae switched languages immediately, said something back, short and sharp, and the aunt went quiet. English, he said. We speak English in this conversation. My wife is in this room that landed. Nia watched it land. She watched the young man by the hallway look at his shoes. She watched the aunt with the cardigan find something important to examine on the wall beside her. She watched a cousin, Soo-jin, the one who had first occupied the master bedroom all those months ago, who was standing near the staircase in a silk robe, look at Nia directly for the first time since they'd been in this room together, and look away quickly, and Nia could see, in that rapid avoidance, the outline of guilt that the woman had been carrying and suppressing, and would continue to suppress if given the opportunity. Soo-yeon recovered. That was the thing about her, she always recovered. You want to know the truth? She said. And her voice had changed again, something in picking up something harder, something that felt like the real register underneath all the performances. The truth is that your wife has never been comfortable in this family, and that is not my fault. I have tried, I have extended myself. I have welcomed her. I slept on the floor for a year, Nia said. She didn't say it loudly. She didn't say it with drama. She said it. The way you state a fact that you are finished pretending isn't one. A year, she said again, every time he left. You gave my bedroom to whoever you decided deserved it that week, and you put me on the floor, and you told me that complaining would make me the woman who destroyed this family. So I didn't complain, and I am done not complaining. The room was very, very still. Soo-yeon looked at her. The performance dropped entirely. What was underneath it was not rage. Rage would have been easier. What was underneath it was the cold appraisal of a woman who has just recalculated a situation and is deciding on a new approach. You have always been an outsider here, Soo-yeon said quietly. Nothing changes that. A ring doesn't change it. A house doesn't change it. My son's name doesn't change where you come from or what you are. The sentence fell into the room like something physical. Several relatives flinched. The aunt with the cardigan made a small involuntary sound and then went silent. Even the young man by the hallway lifted his head. Min-Jae had gone absolutely still. Nia felt it, the specific quality of the silence he was generating, the one that meant he had passed through anger and come out the other side into something more final. She had seen it once before, at a dinner with a business associate who had made a comment Min-Jae deemed disrespectful. She had watched Min-Jae sit very still for exactly 4 seconds, and then say something quietly to the man that Nia hadn't heard, and the man's face had changed completely. She had never asked what was said. She understood the look now better than she had then. He turned to look at his mother. "Say that again," he said. Not a challenge, not a threat. A question asked in the tone of a man confirming that he heard what he thought he heard. Soo-yeon met his eyes. And whatever she saw there, whatever had always lived in her son behind the carefully managed exterior, whatever the people who feared him in professional contexts had learned to recognize and steps back from, she saw it clearly now. And Nia watched Soo-yeon's chin lift slightly, the way a person lifts their chin when they are covering the instinct to step backward. She didn't repeat it. Min-Jae reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out his key ring, the master key to the estate, a single brass key on a plain ring, nothing decorative, the kind of key that opened every lock in this building. He held it in his hand for a moment. Then he crossed the room to where Nia was standing. He took her hand gently, the way you take something that has been set down too roughly and is owed some care, and he opened her fingers and placed the key in her palm and closed her fingers around it. He turned to face the room. "This is her home," he said. "You are guests." The silence that followed was not the silence of agreement. It was the silence of 11 people recalibrating. Soo-yeon looked at the key in Nia's hand. Her face was doing something complex and unreadable, and Nia did not look at it for long, because she had a feeling that if she looked at it too long, she would feel something toward the woman, that she was not sympathy exactly. But the complicated thing adjacent to it, that you feel for someone who has become so defined by control that losing any of it looks like losing everything. Then Soo-yeon looked up at her son and she said, "Then choose." 2 words. They hit the room differently than anything else that had been said tonight. Because they weren't said in anger, they were said with precision, with the full weight of a woman who had played this particular card before and believed it was the highest one in the deck. The ultimatum? The oldest one, blood or marriage, family or wife. You were mine before you were hers. Min-Jae looked at his mother for a long moment. The relatives had gone motionless. Even the ones who had been shifting and looking for exits had gone still. Because this was the moment everything would resolve or detonate, and every person in the room understood it. Min-Jae said, "I'm not playing that game." And Nia felt the floor shift under. The key was still in her pocket when the second car left. She felt it there, that small brass edge pressing against her fingers through the cardigan fabric, while she stood at the living room window and watched the taillights of the second vehicle disappear through the estate gates. 2 gone now, the young man from the hallway and a cousin she barely knew, both of them choosing the simplest exit available. No conversation, no formal goodbye. Just the quiet execution of people removing themselves from a situation that had shifted beyond their capacity to navigate. Min-Jae was on the phone in the kitchen. She could hear the cadence of it Korean, low, the clipped economy of a man conducting business rather than having a conversation. She understood enough by now to catch fragments. Access. Codes this week. She understood he was following through on what he'd said, that security changes, Yong, the restructuring of who moved freely through this house and who didn't. She should have felt something when she heard it. She felt tired. Not the floor tired, not the bone-specific exhaustion of nights spent on hardwood. This was something different. The tiredness that comes after the emergency has passed and your body finally gets the message that it's allowed to stop running on adrenaline, and the crash of that permission is almost than the emergency itself. She sat down on the sofa, the same sofa that, on visits when the floor wasn't an option, had served as her compromise arrangement, the slightly better version of being displaced. She sat on it, now in the quiet of the morning, and looked at the blanket, which Min-Jae had set on the arm of a chair across the room, rather than putting it away. And she thought about the fact that for 13 months this blanket had been her whole accommodation, in her own house, and now it was just sitting there, looking like any other blanket, and the mundanity of that was almost funny, in a way she didn't have energy to access. She heard Min-Jae end the call. He came into the living room and stood for a moment looking at her. She looked back at him. There was something between them that hadn't been there. Before, not distance, not quite. More like the specific space that opens up when two people have finally put a difficult, true thing into the air between them and are still figuring out what to do with all the room it takes up. Yang will come at 3, he said. She nodded. The codes will be changed. Keys will be reissued. He paused. Nobody gets access without your sign-off. That's not, he stopped, recalibrated. I should have built it that way from the beginning. Yes, she said. He absorbed the absence of a softener in her agreement. She watched him absorb it, the slight adjustment in his posture, the small recognition that she was not going to make this easier for him by telling him it was okay, because it wasn't okay, and they both understood that. He sat down across from her. Where is your mother? Naya asked. Her room. She's still here. Yes, Nia looked at him. I'm not asking you to throw your mother out, she said. That's not what I want. What do you want? She had been asking herself that question for 13 months, and she still didn't have a clean answer, which was part of the problem. She wanted things she didn't know how to name without sounding like she was asking for something unreasonable. She wanted to be visible. She wanted to be believed automatically instead of believed only after sufficient evidence. She wanted to walk through her own home without running the internal calculation of who was there and what their presence would cost her. She wanted simple things that had turned out to be the most complicated things. I want to talk to her, Nia said. Min-Jae went still. Not with you in the room. She looked at him steadily. I need to talk to her without you in the room. She could see him working through the objection, the protective instinct, the logistical concern, the legitimate question of whether putting Nia alone in a room with Su Yeon was something any reasonable person would do, given the events of the last 12 hours. She's not going to say anything worse than what she's already said, Nia said. And I need her to hear something from me directly. Not through you, not in front of an audience. She paused. This is something I need to do for myself. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up. He went to the bottom of the staircase and called upstairs 2 sentences in Korean, flat and non-negotiable. A pause. Then Suin's voice from somewhere above, brief. Min-Jae came back to the living room doorway. I'll be in the study, he said. Door open, she nodded. He held her gaze for one more second, something passing through it that she chose to receive as trust, even if she couldn't be entirely certain that's what it was. And then he walked down the hall, and she heard the study chair. The house was quiet for a full minute. Then she heard footsteps on the stairs. Su Yeon came into the living room, the same way she entered every room, with the posture of someone who has decided in advance that they belong there. She was dressed properly now, hair arranged, the overnight dishevelment replaced by the composed presentation of a woman who had taken the time to look like herself before this encounter. It was a choice. Naya recognized it as one. Su Yeon sat down in the chair across from her. The same chair where the blanket was sitting on the arm, between them, like an object someone had placed there deliberately. They looked at each other. You wanted to talk, Su Yeon said. Yes, then talk. Nia breathed in once slowly through her nose. She had not scripted this. She had not made notes, had not planned a structure. She had the thing itself, the raw, unmapped thing she needed to say. And she had the room, and she had the woman in front of her, and that was going to have to be enough. You almost worked, Nia said. Su Yeon's expression didn't change. The whole plan, the floor, the silence, the saving the debt information for the right moment. It almost worked. If he'd been 5 seconds slower, if he'd held the question long enough for me to see it settle, instead of seeing him dismiss it, you would have had it. I would have been standing in that room, looking like the woman who used him, and everything I'd said about the floor would have been reframed as damage control. She looked at her. That's a very patient plan. Most people don't have that kind of patience. I have been managing complicated situations for a long time, Su Yeon said. I know. Nia paused. That's actually what I wanted to say to you. Not to accuse you of it. To tell you that I know. A slight shift in Su Yeon's stillness. Not movement the opposite of movement. The alertness of someone recalibrating. I know that you spent 35 years making sure your son had everything he needed to survive the world he was born into, Nia said. I know that you made choices I will probably never fully understand, that you did things that required you to be harder than most people have to be, and that somewhere inside all of that hardness, you genuinely believe you were protecting him. I'm not here to tell you that you didn't love him. I believe you did. I believe you do. Soo-yeon was watching her with an expression that had gone entirely neutral, the blankness of a woman who has encountered something unexpected and is choosing not to respond until she understands it. But you decided, Naya continued, before you ever knew me, that I was not real. And everything after that, the floor, the bedroom, the threats, the information, you saved all of it, was just execution of a decision you'd already made. And I need you to know that I understand that. I understand it completely. Because I think for as long as you have that decision in place, there is nothing I can do or say that will register as evidence against it. I am fighting a verdict, not a case. Soo-yeon was quiet. So I'm not asking you to change the decision today, Nia said. I'm just telling you that I know it's there, and that I am not going anywhere, and that the next 13 months are going to look different from the last 13, because your son knows now, and the codes are changing, and I have that key. She glanced at her pocket. And I need you to know that I will not spend those 13 months being invisible in order to make the situation comfortable for people who decided I shouldn't be here. The room was very still. Soo-yeon looked at her for a long moment. Her face was doing something complex that Nia could not fully decode. It was not softening, not capitulating, not performing. It was something more internal than any of those things. Then Soo-yeon said, "You are not what I expected." Nia said nothing. When Min-Jae told me he was getting married, I expected. She stopped. Whatever she had expected, she chose not to finish the description. You are not that. What did you expect? Nia asked. Soo-yeon looked at the blanket on the chair arm. She looked at it the way Min-Jae had looked at it the night before, with something that registered involuntarily before the guard came back up. Someone easier to manage, she said finally. The honesty of it landed with the same disorienting force as the night before, when she'd said, "I've been waiting for the right time." The woman was capable of a specific, stripped-down directness that arrived only when the performance was no longer serving its function, and in those moments she was almost easier to be in a room with. "I'm not easy to manage," Nia said. "I understand that now." Good. Another silence, and then Soo-yeon did something Nia had not prepared herself for. She leaned forward very slightly, not dramatically, not as a gesture, and she looked at Nia with something underneath the calculation that Nia had not seen there before. Something tired. Something that looked, for one specific unguarded second, like a woman who had been managing things for a very long time and had not paused to examine the cost of it. She said, "He was all I had after his father died. Everything I did was for him." Nia looked at her. "I know that," Nia said. "Then you understand?" "I understand that it's true," Nia said. "And I understand that it's not enough to justify what happened in this house. Both of those things are true at the same time. I'm not asking you to choose which one to believe. I'm telling you they're both real." Soo-yeon sat back. The moment that fractional open window closed, the composure reassembled itself with the speed of long practice. But something remained that hadn't been there before. Nia couldn't name it, not softness, not remorse exactly. Something that might, given enormous amounts of time and demonstrated behavior, eventually become a precursor to those things. Or it might not. That was the honest assessment, and Nia held it clearly. She stood up. She was done with the conversation. Not because it was complete. It was nowhere near complete. It was barely begun in the context of what it would eventually need to be. But because she had said what she came to say, and continuing beyond that would be performing for an audience that included only herself. And she had been performing for herself for 13 months, and she was finished with it. She was almost to the doorway when Soo-yeon said quietly, "I won't apologize today." Nia stopped. She turned around. "I know," she said. Today wasn't about the apology. She left the room. She walked to the study and stood in the open doorway. Min-Jae was not sitting. He was standing beside the window with his arms crossed, and he looked at her when she appeared with an expression she now recognized as his specific version of barely managed anxiety, the thing he felt when he was waiting for information he couldn't control the content of. Done, she said. How was it? She considered the question honestly. Complicated. He nodded. He understood complicated. It was the primary texture of most things in his life. She came into the study and they stood there for a moment, both of them in the room he'd put her in for safekeeping the night before. And as outside the window, the estate grounds were doing their ordinary late morning thing, the light moving across the lawn, a bird working at something near the hedgerow, the world continuing in its complete indifference to the fact that a significant number of human beings inside this building had spent the last 12 hours rewriting something fundamental. I need to eat something, she said. Yes, and then I need to sleep for about 4 years. Something moved across his face that was the closest he got to a smile when he wasn't fully committed to one. We can work on that. She nodded and turned toward the door, and that was the moment she heard it, the front door. Not the security panel, not the 3 beeps of someone using a code. The front door, which had been standing on an interior latch since Min-Jae came in last night and which now opened with the specific sound of a door that someone is pushing from outside without using a code at all. Because they had a key, and the codes hadn't been changed yet. Young wasn't coming until 3. They both heard it at the same time. She saw Min-Jae's posture change the shift from the man standing at the window with his wife to something older and more automatic, the reading of environment that had kept him alive in a career that had every reason to end him. He moved past her in the doorway without touching her, moved into the hallway, and she followed because the alternative was standing in the study, not knowing what was happening, and she was done with that particular position. In the entryway stood a man she did not recognize. He was maybe 40, in a coat that was too warm for the weather, and he had the look of someone who had dressed for an occasion he'd been thinking about for some time. He wasn't large. That was the first thing she registered, because she had expected large, had expected the debt, Soo-yeon's disclosure, the people her father owed money to eventually manifest in something large. He was medium height, medium build, with the kind of unremarkable appearance that she understood in the context of Min-Jae's world could mean a great many things. He was looking past Min-Jae. He was looking at Nia. Mrs. Kang, he said. His accent was not Korean, not American. Something she couldn't immediately place. Eastern European, maybe, or somewhere further than that. I apologize for the early visit. I've been trying to reach your father. Min-Jae was standing between them. He had not moved toward the man, and he had not moved back, and his stillness was of a completely different quality than any of the stillness he'd demonstrated in the last 12 hours. This was operational, calibrated. The particular control of a man deciding things very quickly. You have the wrong house, Min-Jae said. I don't think so. The man's eyes didn't leave Nia. I have the right house. Mr. Calloway gave me this address himself, quite some time ago. He said if he was ever unavailable, this was where to find the family. Nia felt her stomach drop, not metaphorically. It was a physical sensation, a downward shift in her center of gravity that she felt in her legs. Her father had given these people her address. Her father, who had a debt, who had people after him, who had spent her entire adult life creating problems he expected other people to absorb, had given someone her address. Before she was even married here, probably. Before she was even with Min-Jae. Or after, she didn't know. She didn't know the timeline, and she didn't know the amount, and she didn't know how long this man had her address, sitting in a pocket waiting to be used, and that not knowing was suddenly the most terrifying thing in the room. My father doesn't live here, she said. No, the man agreed pleasantly. But you do, and your husband has resources that Mr. Calloway was very confident could address his situation. Min-Jae turned his head slightly and looked at her. Not with accusation, the 5 seconds had passed. She had seen them pass this morning, and they were gone. But he looked at her with the expression of a man who is processing the fact that a situation he thought he understood has just revealed another layer, and the layer is worse than the one before. She looked back at him. She wanted to say something. She had a whole architecture of explanation in her head, the years of separation from her father's choices, the deliberate construction of distance, the fact that she had known about the debt in the abstract, but had not known about this, had not known that her address was part of whatever transaction her father had been making. She said none of it, because this was not the moment for it. This was the moment for something else entirely. She stepped forward. Not around Min-Jae, she moved to stand beside him, shoulder at his shoulder. And she looked at the man in the coat, and she felt the key in her pocket, and the 13 months behind her, and the morning's worth of things said and heard and survived. And she said, "Whatever my father told you, he was wrong. This house is not a resource available to him. And if you'd like to discuss his debt, you'll need to do that with him. Not here." The man looked at her with the patient, faintly amused expression of someone who is used to being told variations of this and finds them interesting rather than incisive. "Mrs. Kang," he said, "your father's situation has become somewhat urgent." "The timeline is not my problem," she said.
Your husband might feel differently about
My husband," she said, "feels what I've told you he feels, because we are not two separate conversations you can have and then compare. What you heard from me is what is true in this house." She heard Min-Jae exhale beside her. It was very small. It was not relief exactly. It was the sound of a man who has just understood something about the woman he married that he hadn't understood before, and is in the process of updating his model of her. The man in the coat looked between them. He was recalculating, she could see it, the adjustment of his approach, the decision about whether to escalate or withdraw, and try again through a different angle. He looked at Min-Jae. "Mr. Kang," he said, "surely you understand the nature of—" "You're in my house without an invitation," Min-Jae said. His voice was absolutely flat. "You used a key that is being deactivated today. You came here to leverage my wife for a debt that is not hers. And you're still talking." He paused. "I'd encourage you to think carefully about whether continuing to talk is the right choice." The silence that followed was different from every other silence the morning had produced. This one had edges. The man in the coat heard them. She could see him hear them, the slight shift in his shoulders, the recalibration happening beneath the pleasant expression. He was deciding. Whatever calculus he was running, the information he had about Min-Jae, the assessment of the room, the distance between what he'd walked in expecting and what he'd found. Instead, he was running it quickly. He reached into his coat pocket. Every muscle in Min-Jae's body went to a different setting in a single second. She felt it more than she saw it, the change in the air beside her, the absolute change in his quality of presence, from controlled to ready, and her own body responding to it without instruction, stepping back one half step. The man pulled out a card, a business card. He set it on the small entryway table. "For when circumstances change," he said. He turned and walked out. The door closed. The security panel beeped once, the external lock re-engaging, and then the house was quiet, with the specific quality of quiet that follows the removal of something threatening. Naya's hands were shaking. She looked at them. She hadn't known they were shaking until she looked at them. She pressed them against her thighs to make them stop, and they mostly did. Min-Jae looked at her. She looked back at him. "My father gave them this address," she said. Her voice came out steadier than her hands. "I didn't know that. I need you to know I didn't know that." "I know," he said. "I knew about the debt, in the general sense. I didn't know he'd—" "Nia." He said her name with the particular weight he gave it when he needed her to stop talking and hear something. "I know." She stopped. He picked up the card from the entryway table, looked at it, put it in his own pocket. "How bad is it?" she asked. "My father's situation, do you know? I can find out." "I'm not asking you to fix it. I know that too." "I mean it, Min-Jae. I am not. This is not why I know." He looked at her. "Stop trying to prove that to me. You've already proven it." "The proof was the fact that you never asked me for anything in 13 months, including the one thing that would have actually helped you." She looked at him. The morning light was coming through the entryway windows now, the particular harsh light of a day that has been awake for too long and has no interest in being flattering. She stood in it with her hair, still not quite right from sleeping in the study, and her cardigan wrinkled, and her hands that had been shaking, and the key in her pocket. And she thought about the fact that 12 hours ago she had been asleep on a floor, and now she was standing in the same house, having survived a version of a morning she could not have predicted. She was still standing. That registered, slowly, as something significant. From upstairs came the sound of footsteps Soo-yeon moving in her room. Then another door further down the hall. The remaining relatives, still present, still navigating the new configuration of the house, with the careful movements of people who have understood that the map has changed and are trying to read it without asking for directions. Then the footsteps on the stairs. Soo-yeon appeared at the bottom of the staircase with her coat on. Her luggage was not with her, just the coat and her bag, and the careful presentation she had reconstructed in her room upstairs. She looked at Min-Jae. She looked at Nia. She looked at the space between them, the shoulder-to-shoulder configuration, the way they were standing, the fact that Nia had not moved back to a separate position when Soo-yeon appeared. She said, "I'd like to go home." Min-Jae nodded. He pulled out his phone. "I'll have a car. I can arrange my own car," Soo-yeon said. A beat. "All right," he said. She crossed the entryway. She was passing Nia close, their proximity unavoidable in the space, and she stopped. She did not look at Nia fully. She looked at some middle distance to Nia's left, and she said very quietly, so quietly, that Min-Jae, 3 feet away, may not have heard it. "You'll need to be stronger than you think." Then she walked out the front door. It closed behind her with the soft, definitive click of a well-made door doing exactly what it was designed to do. Nia stood in the entryway. She understood what Soo-yeon had meant. She understood it with the particular clarity of a woman who had just spent a morning having every assumption about her own situation revised, who had just looked into the face of a stranger who had been given her address by her own father, who had just stood shoulder to shoulder with her husband, against something neither of them had coming and found that the stance held. She would need to be stronger than she thought, because Soo-yeon was right that she wasn't done. She had said so the night before, with her eyes, when she'd assessed Nia in passing, and Nia had read the assessment clearly. She was not done, and the debt was still out there, and her father was still whoever he was, and the man in the coat had left a card, but he had not left for good. And the codes hadn't been changed yet, and it was only 10 in the morning, and Min-Jae was reaching for his phone again, and Nia's hands were done shaking, but the rest of her was very much still. "I'm not playing that game." The words landed and then just stayed there. In the air, in the room, Soo-yeon didn't move. She stood exactly where she had been standing, her hands at her sides, and she looked at her son with the expression of a woman who has just discovered that the card she believed was unbeatable has been turned over to reveal a blank. Nobody in the room made a sound. Min-Jae didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. There was something in the quality of his stillness that had always been more authoritative than volume, the particular stillness of a man who has learned, over many years and in far more dangerous rooms than this one, that composure is a form of power, and that men who need to shout have already lost something. "I'm going to say this once," he said, and he was speaking to the room now, all of it, his eyes moving across the assembled faces with the slow deliberateness of a man taking inventory. "So I need everyone in this room to hear it clearly." The ant with the cardigan had stopped moving entirely. Soo-jin, still on the staircase, had gone pale. The young man by the hallway had taken a small, involuntary step backward. The way people take steps backward when they realize the room they're in has changed category. What happened in this house while I was away, the sleeping arrangements, the room assignments, the way my wife was spoken to, that ends tonight. Not tomorrow. Not after we've all slept and had a chance to reframe it. Tonight. He paused. If you are a guest in this house, you are here because Nia allows it. Not because I allow it. Not because my mother arranges it. Because she allows it. Those are the rules going forward. Anyone who cannot operate under those rules is not a guest I will be hosting. Soo-yeon's mouth opened. "Min-Jae," I said once, Ma. She closed her mouth. And that specific moment, his mother's mouth, closing on the sentence she had been preparing to unleash, was the moment that something shifted in the room's chemistry entirely. Because Soo-yeon's silence was not capitulation. Nia understood that even as she watched it happen. It was recalculation. The silence of a woman who has played a long game before and knows that the next move is not always the best move. That sometimes you let the board reset and you find your position again from the new configuration. What Nia didn't know what she couldn't have known, standing in that room with the brass key pressed into her palm, and her body aching, and her heart doing something irregular in her chest, was that Soo-yeon had already found it. The new position. She had found it in the 3 seconds between Min-Jae saying, "I'm not playing that game," and the room going silent. And it was worse than the ultimatum, worse than the outsider comment, worse than anything she had deployed in 13 months of carefully orchestrated diminishment. It arrived the next morning. Nia had slept finally, genuinely slept in the master bedroom, which Min-Jae had quietly cleared of Soo-jin's belongings, by moving them to the hallway outside the guest room door, without ceremony or explanation. Just placing them there and walking away, and Soo-jin had retrieved them without comment, at some point before dawn. The bedroom smelled like someone else's perfume, and the sheets had been changed by someone at some point, but were still not quite right. And Nia lay in her own bed for the first time in 9 days, and stared at the ceiling, and did not feel the relief she had expected to feel. She felt watchful. She fell asleep anyway, because her body overrode her instincts, and the house was quiet in a way that felt less like peace and more like held breath. Min-Jae was not beside her. She heard him in the bathroom water running, the particular sounds of a man who has been awake for hours and is now doing the practical things because the impractical things temporarily run out of room to expand. She lay there and looked at the ceiling and listened to the house and thought about the key, which was on the nightstand beside her. She should have felt better. She knew, logically, that last night had been a turning point, that something real had shifted, that words had been said that couldn't be unsaid, that Min-Jae had stood beside her and made his position visible in front of everyone in a way that she had never, in her most optimistic private moments, fully believed he would. She felt worse, not ungrateful, not confused about what he'd done. But underneath the relief was something older and less manageable, the specific grief of a person who must have just had it confirmed that the thing they'd been surviving was exactly as bad as they thought it was. When you carry something alone for long enough, part of you starts to wonder if you're misreading it, if you're being dramatic, if the gap between your private experience and the official version of events is evidence of your own distortion. And then someone else sees it, and the doubt collapses. And all that's left is the weight of how long you carried it without anyone to set it down with. 13 months. The bathroom door opened. Min-Jae came out with his face still damp, his shirt untucked, looking like a man who had not slept and was running on something more corrosive than coffee. He sat on the edge of the bed. She turned her head to look at him. He said, "I need you to tell me everything." She looked at him for a long time. Outside the bedroom door, she could hear the house beginning to shift footsteps on the stairs, voices in the hallway, the sounds of a household that had not yet resolved into its new order and was still feeling for the shape of things. "Now?" she said. "Yes." She sat up. She pulled her knees to her chest and she started from the beginning, not from last night, not from the floor, but from the second month. The first time Soo-yeon had arrived before she was expected. The first time the bedroom was reassigned. The first time Nia had heard the word outsider, used to describe her in Korean between two relatives who didn't realize she'd picked up enough of the language to understand it, or didn't care whether she had. She talked for over an hour. Min-Jae sat on the edge of the bed and listened with the specific quality of attention that she had first noticed in him when they were still new to each other, the way he didn't interrupt, didn't offer reassurance, didn't nod performatively. He just listened with his whole body pointed at her, like a compass needle finding north. She had loved that about him in the beginning. It was different to have it directed at a story about herself. It was harder. She told him about the threats, the exact wording, as best she could reconstruct it. "Tell Min-Jae, and you will be the woman who tore his family apart." She told him about the closet, about the meals, about the relative who had used her skincare products without asking. And when Nia had said something, Soo-yeon had looked at her and said gently that it was important to be generous with family. She told him about the morning she had cried in the downstairs bathroom with the water running. She told him about the blanket, how she had optimized it, how she knew which corner of the floor was better, which side to sleep on, how to set her alarm so she was upright and presentable before the household moved. She watched his face while she said that part. She had been worried about what she'd see their pity, maybe, or the look people get when they realize they were complicit in something, and haven't processed the complicity yet. She wasn't sure she could manage either of those things from him right now. What she saw was different. Nick she saw, he looked like someone had hit him with something they were not holding in their hands. When she finished, the room was quiet. Outside, the footsteps in the hallway had stopped. She had the impression that on the other side of that door, people were very carefully not moving. Min-Jae said, "Why didn't you tell me?" It wasn't accusatory. The tone was genuinely bewildered, and that bewilderment was its own kind of answer to its own question. And she thought he probably understood that even as he said it. "Because she told me not to," Nia said. "And because I was afraid you wouldn't believe me. And because I was afraid that even if you believed me, I would become the problem. The woman who came into your family and made everything difficult. You were the one sleeping on the floor." "I know that," she looked at him. "But she has 35 years on me, and she knew how to make my silence look like consent." He was quiet for a long moment. "I should have seen it. You weren't here. I should have—" He stopped. He pressed both hands flat on his thighs, a gesture she recognized as the physical equivalent of a full stop. "I built systems to protect the people around me. I have men whose entire job is to notice when something is wrong before I do. And I didn't." He stopped again. "You trusted her," Nia said. "I trusted you both." She knew that. That was the whole architecture of it. If you trust both of us equally, and only one of us is talking, the other one doesn't exist. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, not in 2 years of marriage, not across all the difficult moments, and the silences, and the half-explained business trips, and the complicated meals. It was the expression of a man looking at a version of himself he did not like and could not dispute. "I need to go downstairs," he said. She caught his arm. "Min-Jae." She waited until he looked at her. "I need you to hear something before you go down there." He waited. "Whatever you say to them, whatever happens today, I need it to come from you because you understand what was wrong. Not because you're angry. Not because you're protecting me like I'm something that got damaged. Because you actually understand why this was wrong." He looked at her for a long moment. "Do you know the difference?" she asked. "Yes," he said. And then, more quietly, "I'm working on it." She let go of his arm. He left. She sat on the bed with her knees pulled to her chest and listened to the sounds of the house, and for approximately 4 minutes, it sounded like it might resolve into something manageable. Voices below measured the particular rhythm of a difficult conversation being had at controlled volume. Then she heard Soo-yeon's voice change pitch. Not dramatically, but enough. Nia unfolded herself from the bed she stood. She picked up the key from the nightstand. She didn't know why exactly. Some instinct. Some understanding that the object that had been given to her needed to be on her body today rather than on a nightstand. And she put it in the pocket of the cardigan she'd pulled on, and she opened the bedroom door. The hallway was empty. The voices were coming from the main living room. She moved toward the top of the staircase and stopped there, one hand on the banister, listening. Soo-yeon was speaking to Min-Jae. Nia couldn't see them from where she stood, but she could hear the tone, and the tone was not the defensive justification of the night before, not the pivot and reframe, not the performed sorrow. The tone was something she hadn't heard Soo-yeon use before, and it took her a few seconds to identify it, because she had never heard this woman relinquish anything willingly. It was disclosure. Soo-yeon was telling him something. Nia went very still. "Before you married her," Soo-yeon was saying, "there were things I found out, things I had looked into. Because that is what a mother does when her son is about to make a permanent decision." "What are you talking about?" Min-Jae's voice was careful. "Her family," Soo-yeon said. "Her father's business. The debt." The banister was cold under Nia's hand. "There are people she has not told you about," Soo-yeon continued, and her voice had taken on the texture of someone who has been holding something in reserve for exactly this moment and is now finally permitted to use it. "Her father owes money, significant money, to people who are not the kind of people you negotiate with politely. I found out before the wedding. I said nothing because you were in love. and I thought perhaps it would resolve itself. You said nothing about this for 2 years. I was protecting you. You were— Min-Jae stopped. She came to you because of your position, Soo-yeon said. Not because of you. Her family was in trouble, and you were the solution. That is not love, that is strategy. Naya's legs had gone strange beneath her. Not weak, something more specific than weak. There's something that happens when the ground you were certain of turns out to have a different composition than you thought. She sat down on the top stair, not because she decided to, because her body decided it needed to be lower. She sat there with her back against the wall and her hand over her mouth, and she listened to her mother-in-law dismantle the foundation of her marriage, using information that was the sickening part, the part that made the whole thing so much worse, not entirely wrong. Her father had debt. She knew about her father's debt. She had known about it before she met Min-Jae, and she had known about it after, and she had told Min-Jae because it was her father's problem and not hers, because she had spent years separating herself from her father's financial chaos, because she had built a whole adult life at a deliberate distance from it. But she had also, if she was being ruthlessly honest with herself, understood on some level that the stability of Min-Jae's world was not an entirely irrelevant fact when she was deciding whether to marry him. She had not married him for money. She had not married him as a strategy. She had loved him. She still loved him in the complicated, clear-eyed way she had loved everything in her life, which meant she had never been foolish about it, never been without full awareness of the context. Soo-yeon knew that the context could be made to look like motive. Soo-yeon had been holding it for 2 years. Naya understood now why the floor had been a long game, why the silence had been encouraged, why the isolation had been so patient and so consistent. It wasn't purely cruelty. It was cultivation. Soo-yeon had been quietly, methodically building the case for a story she intended to tell at the moment when it would do the most damage, and that moment, it turned out, was the morning after the floor was discovered, when her son was already shaken, already examining his own blindness, already asking the questions that made him vulnerable to a different kind of reframe. She didn't come to you for love. She came to you because you were useful. Nia sat on the top stair. She could hear Min-Jae below her, and she could not hear his response. And that was the most frightening part. The silence from him, where there should have been a denial, where there should have been the quick, clean dismissal that a husband gives when someone accuses his wife of something he knows to be false. The silence went on too long. She stood up. Her legs worked. Now they work the way things work when there's no option but for them to. She came down the stairs and walked into the living room, and she walked in without announcing herself, without softening her entry, and she stood in the doorway and looked at Min-Jae and then at Soo-yeon and then at Min-Jae again. Min-Jae looked at her. She read his face. She had become very good at reading his face. What was on it now was not accusation, but it was not the clean certainty of a man who has already dismissed what he just heard, either. It was the expression of a person who has been handed a question they weren't expecting, and has not yet determined how to hold it. How much, he said, does your father owe? The room had several relatives in it. They had been there, apparently, for the duration of the conversation, standing at various distances, the captive audience for the second act of whatever this had become. Naya was aware of them the way you're aware of furniture, registered, irrelevant, in the way. She looked at Min-Jae. That's what you're asking me, she said. Naya, I just spent an hour telling you what happened to me in this house for over a year, and you are asking me about my father's debt. I'm trying to understand the full picture. The full picture, she repeated the phrase. Something in her chest was happening that she couldn't entirely characterize. It wasn't grief, and it wasn't rage, but it was directly adjacent to both of them, and it was going to need somewhere to go. I slept on your floor for a year because your mother decided I wasn't real enough to deserve my own bedroom, and the full picture you need to understand is about my father's money. She's saying, you knew things you didn't tell me. I know things I didn't tell you. You know things you don't tell me. That is a marriage, Min-Jae, not a clearance application. Soo-yeon made a small sound, not a word, just a sound. The sound of a woman watching a move play out that she had not entirely scripted, but that is proceeding in a satisfactory direction. Nia turned and looked at her. You've been saving that, Nia said. Suyeon met her eyes. You knew that as long as I stayed quiet, you didn't need it. And when I stopped being quiet, you needed something that would make him question me. So you used it. She paused. How long have you been planning that? I found out before the wedding, Suyeon said simply. I've been waiting for the right time. The honesty of it was almost disorienting. After all the management, all the performance, all the carefully constructed versions to have her just say it, plainly, I've been waiting for the right time. It was like watching someone drop a mask and reveal that the face underneath was the same face, just no longer performing. 2 years, Nia said. You sat on it for 2 years. I was protecting my son. You were building a weapon. Nia's voice was completely level. She was surprised by that. You put me on a floor for 13 months to keep me quiet, and when that stopped working, you were going to tell him I married him for his money. That was always the plan. The plan, Suyeon said, was to protect my family from a woman who... Who what? Nia said. Who married your son? Who moved into your son's house? Who had the audacity to expect to sleep in a bedroom? Who came from a family with problems she never disclosed? My father's debt has nothing to do with why I married your son. That is what you say. That is what is true. Suyeon looked at her with the expression of a woman who has spent a lifetime in rooms where the truth was a negotiable item and finds the assertion of its non-negotiability faintly naive. Truth, she said, is what the people with the most information decide it is. Nia stared at her. She had underestimated her. She had known Suyeon was strategic, had understood the manipulation, had felt its effects every day for over a year. But she had underestimated the clarity of the woman's belief system, the degree to which Suyeon was not operating from malice exactly, but from a completely sincere conviction that she was the appropriate person to determine what was real in this. Family, that her son's welfare was the organizing principle around which all other considerations were arranged, and that Nia was not a person who had been wronged, but a variable that had been managed imperfectly. She turned to Min-Jae. He was watching her. He was still doing the thing processing, calculating, the look of a man who has 2 incomplete narratives and is trying to determine which gaps belong to which story. She understood why. She even understood that the questions his mother had raised were not insane questions, that a man in his position had legitimate reasons to want full information about the people closest to him. She understood all of it. She also understood that she was about to lose him if she didn't do something she had never done in this marriage, and possibly in her adult life if she didn't stop managing the information and just tell him something that would cost her. My father, she said, has owed money to people for most of my adult life. I have spent my adult life building something separate from that, because his choices are not mine and his debts are not mine. She paused. I did not tell you because I was not going to use your resources to clean up a mess he made. That was not why I married you. Why did you marry me? Min-Jae asked. The question came out stripped of context, not harsh, not leading, just genuinely asked. And maybe it was the exhaustion, or the strange exposed quality of 1 in the morning honesty that had bled through to 9 in the morning, but he sounded, for the first time in 2 years, less like the controlled, contained man she had learned to navigate, and more like someone who actually needed the answer. Because you listened, she said. Because before I told you anything important, you just listened like it mattered. I had never had someone do that. She looked at him directly. And then I came to live in this house, and I found out that you had never done that for me here. You listened to everyone except the person you married. The room had gone so quiet that the refrigerator hum from the kitchen was audible. Min-Jae looked at her for a long moment. He looked at his mother. And then he did something that nobody in the room, including Nia, expected. He pulled out his phone. He made a call. Short in Korean, 4 sentences. He listened to the response. He ended the call and put the phone back in his pocket. I've asked Young to come by this afternoon, he said. He handles estate security and guest access. He looked at his mother. I'm going to have the access codes changed. Everyone in this house currently in possession of a key or a code will need to see Yong if they want continued access. That includes you. Suyeon went very still. You're changing the code. Yes, because of her. Because of me, he said. because I should have done it when we got married, and I didn't, because I didn't want to have the conversation it would have required, and I thought trust was enough. He looked at the assembled relatives. It was not enough. Soo-yeon looked at him for a long moment. At her son, the son she had raised, whose first words she remembered, whose loyalty she had counted on, with the absolute certainty of a woman who had spent 35 years being the most important person in his life. And then she said quietly, with a precision that cut in a specific direction, "She will leave you. Women like her, they use what they need and they leave. And when she does, you will have nothing left. I will still be here. Your family will still be here." The room absorbed it. Naya felt it land in her chest like something with weight. She waited for Min-Jae to respond. He didn't respond the way she anticipated, not with anger, not with a counterattack, not with the cold finality he'd used the night before. He looked at his mother with an expression Nia couldn't fully read, something between exhaustion and a sadness so old and so specific it looked like it had been stored for a very long time. "Maybe," he said, "but right now, tonight, last night, and for the 13 months before, that you were the one who made sure she would have a reason to." Soo-yeon flinched. It was the smallest movement, a fractional closing of the eyes. But it was the first uncontrolled reaction Nia had seen from her, and in the economy of this woman's expressions, it registered like a fracture in stone. Min-Jae turned to the room. "I need everyone who is not Nia to find somewhere else to be for the next hour," he said. "If you're staying in this house, I'll speak to each of you individually. If you're leaving, I'll have a car arranged." People began to move. They move the way people move when the authority in the room is not being performed anymore, but is just simply present, without discussion, without negotiation, just the quiet compliance of individuals who have recalibrated their understanding of where the lines are. Soo-yeon was the last to move. She looked at Nia as she passed. Not with hatred. Naya had braced for hatred, and it didn't come. What came instead was something that landed harder than hatred would have it was assessment. The cool, measuring look of a woman who is not finished yet, who is simply moving to the next position, who has been doing this longer than Nia has been alive, and who does not believe that a changed door code and a reassigned key represent anything more than a temporary setback in a much longer game. Then she was gone. Nia and Min-Jae stood in the living room. The blanket from last night was still on the floor. Nia looked at it. Min-Jae looked at it too. He crossed the room and picked it up. He stood there holding it for a moment, and Nia watched him look at it the way he had looked at it the night before, with the expression of a man taking inventory of damage in something he was responsible for not protecting. "I need to ask you something," she said. He looked at her. "What your mother said about my father, about why I married you. Did you believe her?" He was quiet for long enough that she felt the pause in her rib cage. "No," he said, "but I felt it. The question. Even though I didn't believe the answer she was offering, I felt the question land and I didn't dismiss it fast enough, and you saw me not dismiss it fast enough." She looked at him. "That was the point," she said. "She didn't need you to believe it. She just needed to put the question in your head while I was standing there. She needed you to look at me differently for even 5 seconds." He nodded slowly. "Did it work?" she asked. He held her gaze. "For 5 seconds," he said. "And then I remembered who told me the question and decided I didn't trust the source." She breathed. It was not a complete relief. There were too many things unresolved, too much said and heard and witnessed for any single answer to function as a resolution. But it was something. "She's not done," Nia said. "No," he agreed. "Whatever just happened, she's recalibrating. She had that information saved for 2 years. She used it, and it didn't work the way she needed it to. She's going to look for the next thing." Min-Jae looked at her steadily. "I know what she's like," he said. "I know you do," Sia said. "But you've never had to be on the other side of it before." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me?" he said. The question was simple. 4 words. She had wanted something like it for 13 months, had constructed elaborate imaginary versions of this moment, in her head on the floor, in the dark, and now that it was here, the simplicity of it almost undid her. She pressed her back teeth together and held herself even, and said, "I need you to stop asking me to be patient with people who have decided I am not real." He looked at her. "And I need you to understand," she continued, "that protecting me is not the same as listening to me. And until tonight, you'd only ever done one of those." He stood there with the folded blanket in his hands. Outside, a car engine started one of the relatives, apparently, who had decided not to wait for a formal conversation and was simply leaving. Through the window, Nia could see it, backing down the long driveway toward the gate. She watched it go. She was still holding the key in her pocket. She could feel the edge of it against her fingers, the specific shape of a thing that had been given to her as a symbol in front of witnesses, and was now sitting in her cardigan pocket like a. The rest of her was very much still standing. That was the thing she held on to in the minutes after Soo-yeon's car disappeared. Through the gates. Not the key, not the changed codes, not Min-Jae's phone calls, or the business card sitting in his coat pocket. Just the simple physical fact of herself, upright, in the entryway of a house that was hers, on a morning that had asked more of her than she had known she had to give, and the giving had not destroyed her. She was still standing. Min-Jae was on his phone. She could hear him in the kitchen. 2 calls. 3. The clipped exchanges of a man activating the parts of his world that ran on information and speed. She understood without being told that he was finding out about her father. Not to manage it for her, not to absorb the debt, the way the man in the coat had assumed he would. To know. Because Min-Jae operated, above all things, on complete information, and he had spent 13 months without it inside his own house, and he was not going to let that condition continue in any direction. She went upstairs. Not to the master bedroom, not yet. She went to the guest room, the empty one. The one that had sat vacant through every visit while she arranged herself on the floor below, the room that Soo-yeon had once told her was for family. She opened the door and stood in the doorway and looked at it. It was a good room. It had always been a good room. A window that faced east and got morning light, a bed with a headboard that was slightly too tall and slightly too formal but solidly made, a chest of drawers that nobody had ever put anything in, a small chair near the window that had a cushion in a color that didn't quite match the curtains, but didn't fight with them either. Nobody had ever slept in this room. In over a year of visits, with the master bedroom reassigned and the couch occupied, and Nia on the floor, this room had sat empty and made, and waiting for a family member who never arrived because the family member who needed a room was never considered family enough to use it. She walked in. She sat in the chair by the window. She sat there for a long time looking at the morning light on the eastern lawn, and she let herself be angry. Not the managed, contained version. Not the anger she had processed into silence and stored somewhere safe so it wouldn't complicate things. The real one. The one that had been building for 13 months and had no safe outlet and had been pressing against the inside of her chest since the night she first folded that blanket and told herself it was temporary. She let it be there. She didn't perform it. She didn't narrate it. She just sat in the chair in the room she should have been sleeping in for over a year and felt the full weight of what had been done to her in this house, in her own house, by people who had decided before they knew her that she wasn't real enough to deserve basic dignity. She felt it without trying to immediately convert it into something more manageable. She let it be exactly as large as it was. It was very large. Her eyes burned. She didn't stop them this time. She cried in the chair by the window, not dramatically, not with sound, just the specific quiet crying of someone who has been holding something for too long and has finally found a room that's empty enough to set it down in. She let it go for a few minutes. The lawn outside didn't change. The light continued its ordinary movement. A bird landed on the hedgerow and left again. When it was done, she felt scraped clean in the way that's different from feeling better. Not better, just emptier of the specific thing that had been filling too much space. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She sat there a while longer, not crying anymore, just breathing, thinking about what Soo-yeon had said in the hallway. You'll need to be stronger than you think. She turned it over in her mind and looked at it from different angles, and she couldn't entirely decide whether it had been a warning or, in some deeply buried and heavily armored way, the closest Soo-yeon was capable of coming to acknowledging that the person she had spent 13 months trying to break had not broken. Maybe both. Probably. Both. She stood up. She smoothed the cushion of the chair which she had not meaningfully disturbed, and she left the guest room and closed the door behind her. Min-Jae was in the hallway. He had come upstairs without her hearing him, and he was standing a few feet from the guest room door, which told her he had been waiting and had decided not to knock. He looked at her face. She let him look. She was past the point of managing what her face showed him. He said, "Your father is in a hospital in Philadelphia." She went still. "Not serious," he said quickly. He had it sounds like a stress-related episode. "He's been there since yesterday. That's why they came here." He gave them this address as a contingency a long time ago, apparently. "Before you were even with me." She absorbed this. "How do you know?" "I called him." She blinked. "You called my father." "I had his number from when we got married. I called him." He paused. He answered. He sounded like a man who has been making bad decisions for a long time and recently had to lie in a hospital bed and think about them. She didn't say anything for a moment. What did he say? He said he was sorry. Min-Jae watched her face. About the address. He said he was going to call you to warn you, but then the hospital, and he stopped. He had reasons. They weren't good enough reasons. She leaned her back against the hallway wall. The plaster was cool through the cardigan. "How much does he owe?" she asked. "Enough. That it's been a weight on him for a long time," Min-Jae said. "Not enough to be a problem for me to address. I want to be precise about that it's not a trivial amount, but it is not. I told you I didn't want you to fix it. I know." "Min-Jae, I know what you said." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going to watch your father sit in a hospital in Philadelphia and do nothing because you didn't ask me to. Those are two different things. Whether I address it is my choice. Whether you ask me to is yours. They don't cancel each other out." She looked at him. "You can be angry at me for that if you want," he said. She thought about it. "I'll let you know," she said. Something moved across his face that reached further than the almost smile from before. She pushed off the wall. "I need to talk to my father." "Yes." "Alone." "Yes." He stepped back. "I'll go deal with Yang when he arrives." "The codes." She nodded. He started to move past her, and she caught his sleeve not to stop him. Just a brief contact, a second of her fingers on the fabric of his shirt, and he stopped and looked at her, and she looked at him, and they stayed in that configuration for exactly long enough. Then she let go. He went downstairs. She went into the master bedroom, which smelled almost like itself again. Almost, but still slightly off. Still carrying the ghost of someone else's presence, the way rooms do after they've been occupied by the wrong person. She sat on the edge of the bed and called her father. He answered on the second ring, "Nia." His voice was hoarse, in a way that wasn't sleep. It was the hoarseness of a man who had been doing a lot of talking, and not all of it voluntary. The particular rawness of hospital rooms and hard conversations, and the aftermath of the body staging an intervention when the mind refuses to. "Daddy," she said. And she hadn't called him that in years, not since she was small, not since she'd grown up enough to understand the full shape of who he was and what he consistently chose, and what she needed to protect herself from. The word came out anyway unbidden, because he sounded like a man in a hospital bed, and she was his daughter, and some things don't fully calcify no matter how much you try. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry about that man coming to your house. I know that was... How long ago did you give them that address?" A pause. "About 3 years," he said. She closed her eyes. "Before Min-Jae," she said. "Before Min-Jae." His voice was quiet. "It was a different debt then. Different people. It's compounded. The address was I thought it was just in case. I wasn't thinking about what it would mean if they actually used it. You were thinking that if things got bad enough, there was a house they could go to," she said. "And eventually I would solve it." The silence was its own answer. "I have been solving your things since I was 17, she said. Not loudly, just factually, the way you state something that has been true. For so long it has stopped being painful and become simply part of the record. You know that. Nia, I'm not asking you to argue with it. I'm just telling you that I know it was not an accident. You knew, when you gave them that address, that at some point they would use it, and I would be there, and that whatever man I was with by then would be expected to handle it. That's not an oversight, that's a plan." Another silence. I don't have a defense for it, he said. I know. I'm in a hospital bed. I know that too. She paused. I'm glad you're okay. I mean that. Whatever else is true, I'm glad you're okay. She heard him breathe. Your husband called me, her father said. I know. He was not what I expected. He wasn't angry. He was just, she said. Yes, that's him. He asked me what I needed, her father said. Not what I owed or who I owed it to or why. He asked what I needed. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall and thought about that for a second. Min-Jae asking her father what he needed. Min-Jae, who had just spent 12 hours learning that his own assumptions about who needed what in his household had been catastrophically wrong, extending that recalibration outward to the next person in the circle. What did you tell him? She asked. The truth, her father said, for probably the first time in a long time, about all of it. She felt something complicated move through her. Not forgiveness, not yet. Maybe not soon. Maybe not in the clean single event way the word implied. But something adjacent to it. The thing that lives next door to forgiveness in the moments when you're too tired to maintain the wall and too honest to pretend the person behind it is a stranger. Rest, she said. I'll come see you when you're out. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She stood up. Rest, Daddy. She ended the call. She stood in the master bedroom in the late morning light, and she looked at the bed and she thought about how she had not slept in it properly, in the uncomplicated way of a person who belongs somewhere and knows it, in over a year. She thought about the guest room down the hall with its east-facing window and its chair with the slightly mismatched cushion. She thought about the blanket, which was still downstairs on the arm of a chair and which Min-Jae had set there, rather than putting it away. And she understood now what she hadn't fully understood when he'd done it, that he was leaving it visible on purpose. Not as a punishment or a monument, but as an insistence on his own accountability. A refusal to let the house forget. She went downstairs. Young arrived at 2:45, not 3, which told her that Min-Jae had called him a second time, adjusted the timeline. He was a quiet man in his 50s, with the organized efficiency of someone who had worked for Min-Jae long enough to understand that tasks were completed when asked and not at leisure. He had equipment for the security panel and a small case for the lock rekeying, and he moved through the house with professional discretion, acknowledging Naya with a nod that contained more respect than she had received from most of the people who'd slept here over the past year. Min-Jae walked him through the changes they needed. Naya stood in the kitchen doorway and listened, and at a certain point, Yong asked a question in Korean, and Min-Jae said, in English, "Ask my wife," and Yong turned to Nia and asked whether she preferred a numeric code or biometric for the primary entry panel. She stood there for a second, with the question landing in a way that was out of proportion to its practical weight. Biometric, she said. For both of you? She looked at Min-Jae. Both of us, Min-Jae said. Yong nodded and made a note. She went back to the kitchen and made herself something to eat, actually made it, standing at the counter with real attention for. The first time in what felt like days, because her body had been running on anxiety and adrenaline, and she needed something ordinary and physical to do with her hands. She made eggs. She ate them, standing at the counter, and looked out the kitchen window at the grounds and thought about nothing in particular, which was an extraordinary relief. The remaining relatives, 3 of them, who had not left with the early departures and had been moving through the house like apologetic shadows all morning, came to find her one at a time over the course of the afternoon. The first was a younger cousin, a woman in her late 20s named Hyun-A, who had been on maybe 4 of the visits and had never directly participated in the worst of it, but had never done anything to stop it either. She stood in the kitchen doorway with an expression that was trying to be both apologetic and dignified at once, which is a difficult combination to hold. I should have said something, Hyun-A said. Nia looked at her. I knew it wasn't right, Hyun-A continued. I told myself it wasn't my place. That it was between you and I told myself a lot of things. Yes, Nia said. Hyun-A looked at her hands. I'm sorry. Nia considered her. She considered whether the apology was genuine, whether it was driven by genuine remorse, or by the practical recognition that the power arrangement in this house had changed and realignment was strategic. She suspected it was some of both, which was probably the honest condition of most apologies made by people who are not deeply practiced at them. "I hear you," she said. Not "it's okay," she was not going to tell Hyun-E it was okay because it hadn't been. But she heard her. Hyun-A nodded. She seemed to understand the distinction. She left the following morning. The other two, the great-aunt from Busan, the one who had taken the couch on the second visit, and a middle-aged male cousin who had been present for 3 of the visits, and had twice sent Nia to get things for him with the casual expectation of a man who has never had to consider whether the person he's asking is the household help or the household came separately, both with versions of the same conversation that ranged from genuinely contrite to technically apologetic without being emotionally present. She received all of it the same way. She heard it. She didn't perform gratitude for it or rush to reassure anyone that they were forgiven. She let the apology be what it was, and she let the people who offered it sit with the fact that it was received but not immediately resolved. By the evening of the second day after that night, the house was empty of everyone except the 2 of them. It was the first time it had been empty, and she thought about it, actually calculated it nearly 3 weeks. She walked through it in the late afternoon quiet and experienced the specific sensation of space that belongs to you. The way silence sounds different when you're not sharing it with people who are positioned above you in every sense. Min-Jae was in his study. She could hear him typing something administrative, the tail end of a workday being conducted from home, rather than from wherever he was usually doing it. She didn't interrupt him. She sat in the living room with a book and read 3 pages and retained none of them, and that was fine. She sat there anyway. She sat in her own living room in the quiet of her own house, and she let the ordinariness of it do its work. He came out 6. He stood in around 6. He stood in the living room doorway, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Dinner?" he said. Yes. They made it together the first time they had done that in recent memory, the specific collaboration of a shared kitchen, the particular negotiation of 2 people in a space, neither of whom is certain of the new rules, but both of whom are operating on a genuine attempt to find them. He cooked the rice. She did the rest. They worked around each other, with the slightly awkward care of people who have known each other's bodies for 2 years, and are relearning each other's intentions. They ate at the kitchen table. They talked not about the big things, not about the last 72 hours, or the man in the coat, or her father in the hospital, or Soo-yeon's car pulling away through the gates. They talked about small things. She told him about something Deja had said on the phone years ago that she'd been meaning to tell him for months. He told her about a problem he'd encountered in Seoul that had resolved itself in an unexpected way, the kind of story he didn't usually tell her, because it involved parts of his work she had learned not to ask directly about. But he told it tonight in the abbreviated version that gave her the shape of it without the parts that had other people's interests in them. It was the most normal 2 hours they had spent together in a long time. Not perfect. She was aware, in the back of her head, of everything that still needed, addressing her father's debt and Min-Jae's decision about it, Soo-yeon and what came next there, the slow work of rebuilding something in her own marriage that had been silently eroding for over a year. She was aware that tonight's ordinary quality was not a resolution, but a breathing space, the first room of a much longer hallway. She was okay with that. When they were done, she washed the dishes, and he dried them, and they put them away in the quiet kitchen, and then she picked up her book from the living room, and she went upstairs. She did not think about what had happened in the weeks before. She did not calculate. She just went to bed. She slept for 10 hours. She didn't dream about the floor. 3 weeks passed before Nia called Deja. Not because she had been avoiding her. She had sent texts, short ones, the kind that communicate "I am alive," and will explain eventually without providing the explanation. Deja had accepted this in the way she accepted most things from Nia, with patience and the reliable understanding that information would come when Nia was ready to give it and not a moment before. She called on a Sunday, which was when she always called, and she sat in the chair in the guest room, the east-facing one, which had become a room she used now, not for sleeping but for sitting, for phone calls, for the particular kind of thinking that needed a view and a chair and nothing else demanding attention. She told Deja everything, not in the managed version, not in pieces. She told her the whole year, the floor, the blanket, the threats, the optimized corner, the morning she'd cried with the bathroom water running, the night Min-Jae came home, the man in the coat, her father in the hospital bed, Soo-yeon's last words in the hallway. Deja was quiet for a long time on the other end. Then she said, "Nia, why didn't you call me?" "I know, I would have come. I know, I would have driven up there and—" "I know, Deja. That's partly why I didn't call." She paused. "I needed to figure out if I could handle it, and I needed to not know the answer beforehand." A long pause. "Did you?" Deja asked. "Handle it." Nia looked out the east window at the morning lawn. "Not gracefully," she said. "But yeah." She heard Deja exhale. "I need you to come visit," Deja said. "Just come to Brooklyn for a weekend and eat food with me and not talk about any of this if you don't want to." Soon Nia said, "I will. I'm holding you to that. I know you are." After she hung up, she sat in the chair for a while longer. She thought about what soon meant, and she thought about the things that still needed to happen before she would feel settled enough to leave the house for a weekend without the faint hum of vigilance she'd been carrying since the night everything broke open. The codes were changed. That was done. The biometric panel required her thumb, and she had pressed it into the reader herself, standing in the entryway with Young and Min-Jae, and watched the green light confirm her. That small light had done something to her. She couldn't entirely explain the green blink of a machine registering that she was authorized, that she belonged, that her presence here was formally recognized by the structure of the place. She had stood there for a second longer than necessary just to feel it. Her father had left the hospital. Min-Jae had resolved the debt. She had not asked him to, and she had not stopped him either. Because he had been right, those were two different things. He had done it without telling her the details first, which she was still deciding how to feel about. And he had told her after the fact in the specific tone of a man who understands he may have overstepped and is prepared to hear that he did. She hadn't told him he had. She hadn't told him he hadn't either. She had said, "I'll talk to my father about how we move forward with that." Min-Jae had nodded. He had heard the "we." Her father had called 2 days after he was released. The conversation was shorter than the one in the hospital he was out now. Physically recovered, and the particular rawness of the hospital bed was wearing off the way it always did. The way her father always moved back toward his default mode of hopeful vagueness when the immediate crisis was behind him. But there was something different in his voice this time. Something that hadn't been there in the years of conversation she'd had with him about choices and consequences and the weight of other people's expectations. He was embarrassed, genuinely in his body, embarrassed. Not about being caught or about the debt itself, but about the address, about the specific act of having put his daughter's home on a list of contingencies for people who were not the kind of people you wanted, knowing where your daughter lived. "I didn't think it through," he said. "No," she agreed. "I was scared and Daddy," she waited. "You have to stop making me the place you put your fear. I cannot keep being that place." A silence. "I know," he said. "I mean it this time. Not because I'm angry. Because I'm telling you clearly what I need from you. And I need you to hear it as clearly as I'm saying it." "I hear you," she believed him. Not completely. She had believed him before in various forms, and the belief had been revised more than once by subsequent events. But she believed him enough to stay in the conversation. She believed him enough to say, at the end of the call, that she would come visit when things had settled more. "With Min-Jae?" her father asked. "Maybe," she said. "We'll see." Min-Jae, when she told him about the call later, was quiet for a long time. They were in bed, not a fraught quiet, just the ordinary late-night quiet of two people in the same space, the lamp on her side still on because she'd been reading. "He's not a bad man," Min-Jae said finally. She looked at him. "He's a man who's been running from things for a long time," he said. "I've known men like that. They're not the same as bad men. They're harder to be angry at, which is its own problem." "Yes," she said. "I'm not telling you to forgive him." "I know. I'm saying I understand why it's complicated." She turned the lamp off. In the dark, she said, "You should have seen me the first time I had to fold that blanket. I stood there for a full minute holding it, and I kept thinking there has to be something I'm missing. Some option I haven't seen. Some way this isn't actually what it looks like. He was quiet, and then I folded it, she said, and I lay down. And I told myself, tomorrow, I would figure out the option I was missing. Did you? No. I just got better at folding the blanket. She heard him breathe. I am sorry, he said. Not for the first time he had said it before, in the hallway, in the kitchen, in various moments over the 3 weeks since the night he'd found her on the floor. But this version was different. This version was said in the dark without anyone watching, without the weight of an audience, or the pressure of a point being made. It was just the two of them, and the dark, and the words. I know, she said, that's not enough. No, she agreed. But it's where you start. The weeks after that settled into something that wasn't quite normal yet, but was moving in the direction of it. Min-Jae changed things about how he worked, not dramatically, not a complete restructuring, but the specific adjustments of a man who has identified a pattern he doesn't like in himself and is doing the unglamorous work of changing it. He told her when he was leaving, before making the final arrangements rather than after. He called more often. Not for long, he was still a person who didn't use phone calls as emotional vehicles. That hadn't changed, but consistently, the way you water something you've decided to keep alive. He stopped solving problems she hadn't asked him to solve. Or he tried to. He backslid on it twice, both times with the sheepish acknowledgement afterward that he'd done it again and was working on it, which she found more useful than if he'd succeeded perfectly. She started leaving things in rooms again. That was the marker she noticed. The book on the living room table, the running shoes by the front door, the coffee mug she liked in the cabinet closest to the machine instead of pushed to the back where she'd moved it to stay out of the way. Small things that meant she had stopped pre-managing her own presence. Deja came in October. She arrived on a Friday afternoon and walked through the front door with her overnight bag and her specific brand of loud, cheerful presence that had always operated as an antidote to whatever Naya had been sitting in alone. And she walked through the entryway and into the living room and stopped in the middle of it and looked around. This is a ridiculous house, she said. I know, Nia said. I'm not complaining. This is a lot of house. She turned around slowly. Where was the floor situation? Nia pointed. Deja walked to the spot. She looked down at the hardwood. She stood there for a moment, looked at places where something significant and not dramatically, just wanting to account for it, wanting to see it with her own eyes. Okay, she said. Okay, Nia said. Deja looked at her. How are you actually? Better than I was. Not where I'm going to be. That's an honest answer. I'm working on those. They had dinner with Min-Jae that evening, which was an experience Nia had anticipated with moderate anxiety, and which turned out to be its own kind of illuminating. Deja was direct with him in a way that most people weren't, not confrontational, but clear, the way she was direct with everyone, a quality that had sometimes driven Nia crazy and now felt like exactly the right frequency for this specific table. She asked Min-Jae, over the main course, what he'd thought when he'd first understood what had been happening in the house. Min-Jae considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I thought, he said, about a building I know, a structure that looks completely solid from the outside.
Yeah.
And then you find out the foundation was compromised years ago, and nothing fell down, which is lucky, but it's not the same as it being okay. It was luck, not strength. Deja looked at Nia. Nia looked at her plate. And Deja said to Min-Jae, and I'd been walking in and out of the building every day telling myself it was fine, because nothing had collapsed yet. He said. Deja nodded slowly. That's a good answer, she said. That's an honest answer. I'm working on those, Min-Jae said. He glanced at Nia when he said it. She met his eyes across the table. After dinner, while Min-Jae was in the study, and she and Deja were on the living room sofa with their legs tucked under them, and the kind of easy quiet that only exists between people who have been friends long enough to not fill all the space. Deja said he loves you. Yes, Nia said. It took him too long to show up. Yes, but he showed up. Nia thought about the night, the headlights on the ceiling, the kneeling, the key, the way he had stood beside her in the entryway when the man in the coat arrived and not in front of her. The specific difference between those two configurations and what each one meant. He showed up, she said. Soo Yeon called in November. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Naya was in the kitchen and saw the name on the screen and stood there for 2 full rings, deciding whether to answer, not because she was afraid of the conversation, but because she was determining whether she was ready and deciding that ready was probably not the standard she was going to achieve beforehand, and she might as well answer. "Hello," she said, Nia. Soo-yeon's voice was not soft exactly, but different from any register she had heard the woman use before. Not the performed warmth of when Min-Jae was present, not the cold precision of when he wasn't. Something stripped of both, which made it harder to place and, paradoxically, easier to listen to. "I would like to come and see you," Soo-yeon said. "Not Min-Jae, you. I would like to come and speak with you." A silence. "When?" Nia asked. "Whenever you're willing." She looked out the kitchen window. The grounds in November were stripped down to their basic geometry, the hedgerows bare. The lawn a duller green, the whole property looking more honestly itself without the softenings of summer. "Next Saturday," she said, "in the afternoon." "Thank you," Soo-yeon said. She hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment. She told Min-Jae that evening. He went still when she told him the specific stillness she had learned to read as him resisting his first instinct. "I'll be in the study," he said. "Door open or closed?" she asked. He thought about it. "Your choice," he said. She decided on closed. Not because she needed to protect him from what would be said, but because this conversation, this particular one, had nothing to do with him, and she wanted Soo-yeon to know that she could have it without requiring his proximity. Soo-yeon arrived on Saturday at 2. She came in a car she'd arranged herself. She came alone. She came to the front door and pressed the doorbell, not the intercom panel, not a code the doorbell, like a visitor. Nia opened the door. Soo-yeon stood there in the November afternoon with a scarf that was too light for the temperature, which told Nia she had dressed for the inside of a car, and not accounted for the walk to the door, which was the most human detail she had ever noticed about this woman. She looked at Nia. Nia looked at her. "Come in," Nia said. They sat in the living room. Soo-yeon looked at the space, with the eyes of someone seeing it freshly, not the familiarity of a woman who had rearranged it and occupied it for years, but something more uncertain. The new furniture arrangement that Nia had made after the visit, small changes. The sofa moved slice. The sofa, Tochirdichen registered on Soo-yeon's face as data being processed. The blanket was not there. She had moved it upstairs weeks ago, folded on the chair in the master bedroom, where it had simply stayed. Soo-yeon folded her hands in her lap. She said, "I practiced what I was going to say." Nia said nothing. "I practiced it several times. It was a very good speech." She looked at her hands. "I'm not going to give it." Nia waited. "What I did to you in this house," Soo-yeon said, "was wrong. It was deliberately wrong. I want you to understand that I'm not here to tell you I didn't understand what I was doing, because I did. I understood every part of it. I decided that keeping my son's life the way I thought it should be was worth doing wrong things to you, and I did them, and I was wrong." She paused. "Not just about the methods, about the whole premise. You are not what I decided you were before I knew you." Nia sat with that. "What did you decide I was?" she asked. Soo-yeon was quiet for a moment. "A mistake my son was making," she said. "Someone who would take him away from the things that mattered. Someone I could wait out." She looked at Nia directly. "I was wrong about all three." The room was quiet. Outside, a wind moved through the bare hedgerows. They could hear it faintly. "I'm not going to tell you it's okay," Nia said. "I'm not asking you to. I'm not going to tell you that you're forgiven and we can start fresh. That's not how this works." "I know. But I'm going to tell you something true," Nia said, "which is that I don't want this to be what it's been. Not for your sake, for Min-Jae's, and for my own, actually, because carrying something against a person is its own kind of weight, and I have been carrying too much weight in this house for too long." Soo-yeon looked at her. "So I'm willing," Nia said, "to let this be the starting point, not the ending point. Not forgiveness, the starting point, which means you come to this house as a guest who respects that it's my house, which means if you have concerns about Min-Jae, you take them to Min-Jae, which means if you have concerns about me, you take them to me directly, not as a weapon and not through him, which means we build it, if we build it, on what actually happens, Not on the story either of us had in our heads. Soo-yeon was quiet. That's not a small ask, she said finally. No, Nia said. It's not. Another silence. I can try, Soo-yeon said. That's all I'm asking. They had tea. It was not a warm conversation, not yet. Maybe not for a long time. But it was honest, which was something neither of them had quite managed in the same room before. Soo-yeon asked about the house changes, and Nia told her plainly what she'd done and why. Soo-yeon asked about Nia's work she had. Apparently at some point looked into what Nia had done before she married Min-Jae, and Nia told her that she was beginning to think about going back to it. The research she'd walked away from, in some form. Soo-jin said, You should. Nia looked at her. You're not a person who should be without work, Soo-jin said. I understand that now. I thought it was a weakness, not having the stability of this house, wanting something outside of it. I understand now it's the opposite. Nia nodded. When Soo-yeon left, she stood at the front door and watched the car go down the driveway, and she felt not resolution, not closure. The thing before those things, the thing that makes them possible. The sense that a structure previously damaged has been examined honestly, and the examination itself is a kind of repair. She closed the door. Min-Jae appeared from the hallway. She looked at him. How was it? He asked. Hard, she said. Better than I expected. Not as good as it needs to eventually be. He nodded. She said I should go back to work, Nisa said. Something crossed his face. I think so too, he said. I should have don't. She looked at him. Don't start the sentence. I know what the end of it is, and I don't need it tonight. Tonight, I just need you to know that I'm going to, and to be glad about it. He looked at her for a moment. I'm glad, he said. She walked past him toward the staircase. She was almost to the top when she heard him say, from below, Nia. She looked down at him. He was standing in the entryway with his hands in his pockets and looking up at her, and he looked, in that moment, less like the feared thing he was in the world, outside these walls, and more like a person, just a person, flawed in ways he was still accounting for, standing in a house that was both of theirs now in the way it should have always been. I know I can't, he stopped. Started again. I know there are 13 months I can't undo. No, she said. You can't. I'm going to spend the next 13 trying. She looked at him from the top of the stairs. That's a start, she said. She went to bed. The blanket was folded on the chair in the corner of the bedroom, where Min-Jae had put it the night he came home. The night of the headlights on the ceiling, the key, the front door opening at 1 a.m. into a house that had been holding its breath. She had moved it once, to see if she wanted it somewhere else. She'd moved it back. It had earned its place there. Not as a trophy, and not as a wound, but as the honest record of a year that had happened, that she had survived, that had changed the shape of things permanently in the ways that mattered. She got into bed. She turned off the lamp. The bedroom was dark and quiet and entirely hers, and she pulled the covers to her chin and listened to the sound of the house around her the way it settled in the cold. The faint movement of branches outside the window, the distant sound of Min-Jae coming up the stairs and moving through the hallway with the same measured pace. He moved through everything. The bedroom door opened. He came in. He moved through the dark with the ease of someone who knows this room. He got into bed. The dark was the same on both sides. She lay there and she thought about nothing specific, which was different from the floor. The floor had always been full of specific thoughts, the continuous calculation of a woman in a situation she was managing. This was empty in the way that spaces become empty when they finally belong to you. She thought about the green light on the entries panel. Her thumb, authorized. She thought about Soo-yeon's car in the driveway and the scarf that was too light for the temperature and the practiced speech she'd decided not to give. She thought about her father, somewhere in Philadelphia, sitting with the shape of his own choices. She thought about Deja in Brooklyn, who would ask on Sunday how she was doing and would accept a real answer because Nia had decided to start giving real answers. She thought about none of these things for very long. She was already falling asleep. And for the first time in a long time, for the first time since a Thursday in October 13 months ago when a black SUV pulled through the estate gates, and she smiled at the wrong people and told herself it was temporary she was falling asleep. In her own bed, in her own house, exactly where she was supposed to be. The chair in the corner held the blanket in its fold. The east window waited for morning. The house was quiet all the way to the gates. And Nia Calloway Kang slept, deeply and without apology, until the light came back.